Hey Matt. Hey Kat. Great. Well, I'll just get going with the summary for today. So today we're talking about the first actual essay, apart from the introduction that we talked about 2 weeks ago, in The Rediscovery of Meaning. And it is the title essay, The Rediscovery of Meaning. And there's so much packed into this essay. I just love it. For me, it was one of the first texts by Barfield that I read after Saving the Appearances, and I was just like, wow, because he starts out by addressing something that nowadays people, I think, refer to broadly as the meaning crisis. And some will say, as Barfield acknowledges in the introduction, that this is just something that is like a expression of human nature, like a pure cussedness. But he's like, no, actually, there's a clear historical genesis of this imaginary, I guess, defined by the meaning crisis that we inhabit, that many inhabit today. And he connects it with the rise of the scientific method and what he describes as this new habit, practice, you could say, of attending to the natural world and just focusing on the phenomena as appearances or objects and trying to develop some kind of systematic understanding of their cause and effect interlinkage. So it's a kind of like technological understanding of the natural world. And that eventually this gets codified into what gets called positivism, but you could say more broadly materialism, and he connects it, mentions that arising in the 19th century, where there's as a kind of ideology that uh, this way of approaching nature is the only valid way of arriving at knowledge, or this is the only source of knowledge. This is maybe not very complex representation of positivism. I'm not an expert on it, but just as Barfield presents it here. And eventually, this assumption gets sort of entrenched in the cultural imaginary that something like a science of meaning is impossible. And throughout this process, this intellectual history, he mentions that there's also emerged a kind of compromise that philosophers have articulated between the truths of science and the truths of religion, and that they somehow don't have anything to do with each other. And if they do, we can never really know it as human beings. It's beyond our capacity. And he said, this was something that could be maintained up until a point, but it's ultimately unsustainable. And he points to what he calls logical positivism, or the extension of this approach to the natural world to our understanding of language and meaning. And this view of language as needing to aspire after the same kind of accurate communication of science, and only refer like what only counts as a real reference to anything meaningful must be connected with the material world. But that ends up eliminating so much of the meaning that the word meanings that we use all the time and navigate our lives with. And so he says, he quotes C.S. Lewis on this, that if driven to its logical conclusion, that the positivist worldview uh, being applied to language, that we arrive at the view, if positivism is right, the history of the human mind since the beginning of time has consisted in almost nobody making linguistic mistakes about almost nothing. Because if if only what counts as meaningful are what we can measure and study through the physicalist approach of science, then words that refer to inner realities and moral realities, you could say, what words that are bound up with like virtue or love, these become meaningless and just kind of language games that we play. And so it pushes us to this sort of absurd situation. And Barfield says, at last the choice is plain. Either we must concede that 99% of all we say and think or imagine we think is meaningless verbiage, or we must, however great the wrench, abandon positivism. And as I mentioned, there's so much packed in here. And one of the things that he packs in here is what I would say for him, the revelation of semantic history, the way semantic history reframes this whole understanding of the human being and nature. And so when I say semantic history, it's just the phrase he uses to refer to looking back in the history of language and seeing how words have transformed over time. And he asks the question, how did it come about that a very high proportion of the words in any modern language do refer or appear to refer to matters and events which are not part of the world accessible to our senses? So if what's really real, as the positivist um, orientation insists on, is just the physical world, how did it come about that we have so many words that refer to realities that are beyond what we can just perceive with our senses? And so he points to this fact that a lot of people interested in etymology note, which is that the further back you trace words that don't seem on the face of it to have a material reference, the more you find that they do actually. If the further back you go, that they have this kind of symbolic character, or what he uses here, metaphorical character, and he quotes somebody giving examples. For instance, the word expression, like expressing ourselves was once a kind of well, carried this double meaning of squeezing something out. And so it's implied in the the fact that the word expression, a word like expression, has an origin like that, is that the primordial experience included a kind of insight that didn't just come about gradually in coming to understand the world better and better, but was gradually articulated through the world already having a kind of symbolic character about it, so that we could symbolize with the outer world to gradually articulate ourselves more and more, and gradually differentiate ourselves and make this bring about this distinction of subject and object. So he says, we find that all words used to describe the inside of ourselves, whether it be a thought or feeling, can be clearly seen to have come down to us from an earlier period when they also had reference to the outside world. And then further on this page, page 19, there's this moment that's so important. It's a moment that I've certain sentences from this passage I've quoted many times writing about Barfield, and I think it also helped me to understand Steiner better when I read The Philosophy of Freedom, because I hear it sort of loud and clear right here. And one of the things that Steiner insists upon in The Philosophy of Freedom is that though thinking is something that, at least at this time, the evolution of consciousness or history, that requires our sort of willing participation to unfold. It's also something that is not just ours, but is part of the world that we participate in. And I think that really comes through here when Barfield is asking the question, how did it come about that the shapes and objects of the outside world could be employed and were employed by man to express the inner world of his thought? It is because he was able to use them not merely as signs for drawing attention to his feelings and impulses, but as symbols for his concepts. So what that implies is that the world has a kind of meaningful character to it, that the recurrence of certain appearances that then we gradually internalize through memory have this idea-like character that transcends the appearances, the fleeting appearances, which are symbols of that sort of spiritual reality, you could say. A thing functions as a symbol when it not only announces but represents something other than itself. We owe the existence of language to the fact that the mental images into which memory converts the forms of the outer world can function not only as signs and reminders of themselves, but as symbols for concepts. And then he goes on to say, uh, the first metaphors were not artificial, but natural. So the world is a kind of speaking world, and the gradual emergence of self-consciousness sort of depends upon that primordial, immediate awareness of meaning in the world, but a meaning that human beings were not at one time um, able to distinguish themselves from, and so we're just sort of caught up in like living it out. And so for him, this also has implications. This sort of revelations of semantic history have revelations for how we narrate the evolution of human as a creature on Earth, and that this idea that consciousness is something that has come about later after the material world, after the outer world. That the inverse is true, or not necessarily an inverse, but that there's a reciprocal, like co-arising of world and consciousness depicted in the history of language. And so then he raises the question, how might this well, one thing I didn't mention was that in connection with, what he makes the points to as the, I guess you could say, historical cause of the meaning crisis, or something that is um, bound up with it, this rise of scientific method and the inattention to the world as meaningful because we're focused on like how it works. Um, that th this question, can there be a science of meaning, he raises later on? Can there be a renewal of our capacity to read meaning in the world, which I think we're doing all the time, especially in our very, like human context, or like reading gesture, we're reading all the time, not just words. Um, and so, yeah, he raises this question, is it possible? And of course, he has this great phrase that nature ought to be viewed as a series of images symbolizing concepts. And that with the Romantics, there's a kind of effort to return to this initially through a kind of reflection upon art and the human capacity to create, to participate in the creative process of nature through art. And what is it that makes something truly beautiful? That it participates in the kind of organic character of the natural creativity, and that the human can also create in that way. But then also there's this possibility of bringing that contemplation that was brought to art to nature itself, with this pursuit of penetrating, he uses the phrase, to the meaning, or to read nature once again, to read meaning in the natural world again. The German idealists, as Matt knows very well, he could talk about it much better than I, but around Goethe at the time, were excited by the prospect of something they called intellectual intuition, which Kant said was impossible, to have this kind of uh, immediate participation in the ideas that are the creative ideas that are giving rise to the appearances of nature. So, of course, uh, Barfield ends the essay by pointing to Goethe as the exemplar for how this renewal of reading in the book of nature might come about. But he also makes a distinction with the Romantics, in that what he thinks is necessary, especially, with this untenable compromise between the truths of religion and the truths of science, is that there's going to need to be a kind of science of meaning that goes beyond just, what does he say? Um, I puts it really, in the book of nature, the whole may mean something, but the details mean nothing. Or if they do, we can never know it. So there's this need for an approach that can deal with the details and but it also it can't just do so in accordance with how we know the details in mechanical science, because as we rise, as he mentions, from you know biology to psychology to sociology, the meanings become ever more complex and we're dealing with more context. And so how do we bring a science of meaning to that? And I think obviously implicit in here is like, him Steiner as another example of this possibility. Um, but I was again, reminded of the introduction and the quote in the introduction where Barfield says this whole process, like from what we might assume or what can be, I guess, how one could characterize the emergence of language, and language as a symbolizing capacity helping human beings to gradually articulate their own self-consciousness out of the kind of soul of nature, the unity of nature, and then the sort of like forgetting of the meaning of nature, but this potential to renew our awareness of it that is also coincident with a new or a kind of, yeah, a new notion of like human creativity as like participating in the divine creativity that has brought about nature, that this, you could say, depicts, where are we? Six. Something like a divine word that has been gradually clothing itself with the humanity at first gradually created, so that what was first spoken by God may eventually be respoken by man. So I'll stop there and we can jump into conversation now. Thank you for your attention. What did y'all think of the essay? Go ahead, Bruce.
Didn't have my microphone. I couldn't get my artificial hand to raise there, so thank you. I just wanted to say something, at the very end of the essay, he talks about the need for doing Goethean science. And I wanted to say something about that because a lot has been done, or things have been done anyway. I don't know if, it hasn't become the situation that you can apply for an NSF grant and say that you're doing Goethean science. So it hasn't come to that level, and maybe it shouldn't. But there is quite a bit that's been done. But before I say that, I just wanted to point out that this essay was written in 1961, was published in, I just forgot where it was published. I know Owen knows. Saturday Evening Post, I believe. And it's just really completely remarkable that Owen Barfield was doing this and writing this in 1961 and publishing it in such a external, it's not an anthroposophic journal, it's not a spiritual journal, it's a Saturday Evening Post. I mean, just completely amazing to me and a foundational document. But time goes on and things go on. So what's been done in Goethean science? So, and I'll post some of the stuff in a chat so I don't spend very much time on this, but some of the names, Mark Regner has published a lot of things in scientific journals that specifically mention Goethean science. Arthur Zients, of course, has put books out and things that are very much out of Goethean science. Craig Holdridge is with the Nature Institute, has done a lot of work on perception of animals and so on. And there are a number of people publishing in German, perhaps even more in German, that I'm not as familiar with, but I have got the names here I can share. But the thing I wanted to get to that touches on my own work on this and touches on something that I think is very important about Goethean science. And so a number of us have wondered about, what what would a Goethean approach look like if it's not about external facts, if it's not about positivist descriptions of external nature? And what I came to, and I think others have came to, is that it's about training. So one
What
way
was
of
that?
thinking about Goethean science is to think about how someone transforms themselves or learns themselves, and how a Goethean scientist, assists in that. So Goethean science as a way of teaching, so that the product is not an external description, but the product, and this is really the wrong word, is a person who has learned something that they didn't know before, learned something of an inner nature. So let me give you an example of that from my own work. And this doesn't get attention in Goethean science because I didn't put the big Goethean science label on it. There is a paper out there that tries to relate it a little bit to what anthroposophists call Goethean science, but it wasn't published in a big journal, and it wasn't. So it's mostly been done in traditional scientific journals using traditional scientific language. So based on my readings of Steiner, I got interested in Goethe and holism. I read Goethe very carefully, realized that he wasn't just talking about holistic stuff. He was talking about a way that the part and the whole relate to each other. So the part-whole duality became something that led me to work with cognitive scientists, who I was incredibly surprised when I said, well, I'm kind of interested in this holistic approach. And they said, oh, well, I reckon cognitive scientists would be completely comfortable with that term holistic. I went, whoa. And so I started exploring that, and I found out that there were cognitive scientists who really worked in that area. And I started developing software that would teach people in a new way, in a different kind of way. So I wanted to take what an anthroposophist would call a very harmonic tool and completely turn it around. And I did that by connecting with the work of Gauthier, what's her first name? Can't think of her, at Vanderbilt, who worked on right and left brain visual processing. So this is an hour-long talk about how human visual processing works. But the short thing is that we don't have good access to how we process visual images. And so there's lots of really interesting effects that people have shown very strongly with experimental evidence that we don't have good access to these images that we produce. So we can use that. And Isabelle Gauthier at Vanderbilt did use that and was able to train people to recognize things holistically in visual domains with which they had no previous experience. And to make sure they had no previous experience, she made up little animal-like things called greebles. And since they were completely created, no one could have ever seen one before. Well, okay, so I took her methods and I used it to identify plants. We created software that would show people pictures of plants and ask them to identify them. We would do it very quickly so that the image of a plant might be put on the screen for as low as 1/10 of a second. And they had to identify the plant from that. The images were standardized, so they couldn't recognize the plant because the flower was over here on one and over here on another one. They were all standardized kinds of images. And it showed that this really works. It really works to get people to identify plants. Now, what's going on with that? The student who does this develops a different relationship to nature. So the student, I remember at the end of a class one time, I had two twins in the class, and one of the twins contacted me near the end of the semester and said, well, you know, something happened today that I would have sworn was never going to happen in my life. I was arguing with my twin about what the identification of a plant was. So that means they're looking deeply at nature in a way they never looked at it before. And so that's a transformation of their inner life. And that's what I was going for in this. So I would argue this is Goethean science. but it is not Goethean science in the way that we've coded Goethean science, right? And so I think here's my big point, not about my research, but about I think this stuff is out there. It's not being called Goethean science. It's not being done in anthroposophy. I'll put some things in, as I say, the chat where it is, but I think there's stuff out there and that it's moving in this way. And it may be moving in ways that don't appear externally, like my work doesn't appear externally as a locating Goethean science. Well, that's what I had to say. I hope it's useful.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's lots of fellow travelers, uh, similar methods.
I can chime in now. Thanks, Bruce and Ashton, for your introduction. I wanted to follow up on a similar subject in terms of, where we might find, well, what's the state of Goethean science, so many decades after Barfield's remarkable essay, for which this collection of essays is named. Um, this summer, I went to a conference in Tübingen, Germany, that was um, organized by Christoph Huick, who wrote this book that I highly recommend, Evolution in the Double Stream of Time. Um, Christoph is a geneticist by training, but he's also an anthroposophist, and he's trying to apply Goethean methods, um, the sort of and the Steinerian understanding of a threefold structure of an organism, actually to the molecular level, to look at DNA and RNA and proteins using the same sort of intuitive perception, which is quite novel. And I think he has some success at that in this text. So he organized this conference as an attempt to bring together some of the philosophers of biology in academia at present who are pushing beyond the reductionist neo-Darwinian paradigm and understanding of evolution towards what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis, where, I mean, this might not seem that mind-blowing or radical to, a group of anthroposophists or Goetheans, but recognizing the agency of organisms is something that biology for over a century has pretty much, not wanted to talk about, instead just looking at population genetics and searching for different kinds of mechanisms and so on. So, finally, biology is beginning to open up again to the idea that organisms have a kind of agency, that they're not passive victims of evolution by natural selection, but actually have some creative capacity to evolve themselves. But in any event, there were anthroposophists at this conference speaking about the Goethean method, and then these, holistic, I could say, more expansive philosophers of biology, more in the mainstream of academia, were interested but not convinced, I would say, by the kind of intuitive participatory methodology that was being um, unpacked. And the issue seemed to me to be that even in these philosophers of biology who are pushing the envelope beyond reductionism and materialism in the study of life, there's still this wall that prevents them from maybe being open to the need for the metamorphosis of the scientist alongside the metamorphosis of uh, the organism that they might be studying. That deeper commitment to a participatory relationship with the phenomena, where our own inner experience of conscious self-reflection or thinking activity uh, is is attended to at the same time that we're attending to, say, the developmental growth patterns of an organism. Um, there's still some hesitancy there and a desire to maintain that, objective distance from the phenomenon that's been so important for the development of modern science. And so that seems to me to be the sticking point here. Um, because there's a worry among the academics that allowing subjectivity into science is going to just be a free-for-all. And um, I think that's where we need to focus our attention, I think, um, is on understanding our own subjectivity, not as just a place for fantasy and whims and, all of that to flow in and distort our perception of reality, but rather to really understand imagination as an organ of perception and an organ of cognition. Um, that's what was brought home to me from this experience at this conference, which was a real, meeting of worlds. Hopefully that can continue. But I will say just one last thing about what Barfield writes on page 22 towards the end about how the Goethean method um, of coming to perceive the inside, which cannot be weighed and measured, or even without training observed, namely the creative thoughts which underlie phenomenal manifestation. He then says that before the scientific revolution, when some attention was still paid to such problems, they would have called it potential as distinct from actual nature, right? So he's saying here Goethe was able to perceive the potentials underlying what's already actualized. And that really jumped out at me because there's a lot going on both in physics and biology to recover this realm of potentials. Um, there's a whole I'll just mention, I'll drop some names. Ruth Kastner's interpretation of quantum physics, is she calls it the possibilist interpretation, where she's taking seriously the idea that in addition to the already actualized particles, there are these fields of potential which need to be brought into our scientific picture of nature. And similarly in biology, I think most of you have probably heard of Michael Levin. He's a lot I could say about Michael Levin in terms of the metaphysical direction he's moving in, but he's talking about bioelectric fields, which are kind of like fields of potential, which cannot be reduced to genetics, cannot be reduced to anything physical, right? And I'm not putting words in his mouth. That's his view. He's a hard-nosed lab scientist at Tufts University who's making reference to what he calls a Platonic morphospace. And I don't know that Michael Levin has the perceptual capacity that Goethe cultivated to see this for himself, but he's developed instrumental methods of seeing these fields and manipulating these fields, which without the attendant, I think, participatory sensitivity to what he's messing with could go in a very bad direction. But I think it's a sign of a realization within science that what Barfield is here calling potential is necessary just to understand the phenomena in a scientific way. So some helpful signs, maybe. Yeah, I'll shut up now.
Oh, may I?
Yes, yes.
Thank
People, you
thank
can
you.
just chime in.
I will jump. Um, yeah, I guess have on the tail of that in Bruce's contribution, just the other fields, like for example, phenomenological psychology is making a comeback, in a certain sense, and it's in route through cognitive science, as Bruce alluded to. And I think the work of John Vervaeke is very suggestive of something that is fastly metamorphizing, or metamorphosing is the right way to put that, I guess. It's happening quickly, and it's happening for people to the point of theological conversions. And I can see why why scientists would be conventional, ordinary, mainstream scientists would be cautious about the subjective aspect, the merely psychological subjective aspect. But I think there's also underlying that a fear of the theological or mythological aspect that is undeniably part of the sort of threefold epistemological reality that we have to approach the world in, if not fourfold. And I would say that art, science, and religion are newly at play in mainstream, sort of upper crust of mainstream, or um, uh, the most vital, I would say, of um, of the mainstream flow is starting to emerge with kind of religious conversion associated with it without losing the scientific methodology. And so I think this harmonizes with what Bruce was offering, and it's no accident, I suppose, that that John Vervaeke himself has a 50-hour video series addressing the meaning crisis, and that one of the hours is spent on Barfield. And I don't know where he is now, because from a neo-Darwinist perspective, I think, which is where he was at that time, the idea that there was an evolution of consciousness didn't fit his notion of evolution. But I think he's thinking more in theological or mythological proportions now, and appropriately for the sphere of knowledge that it will take to what Jordan Hall calls coming into a healing relationship with the whole.
Thanks, Jeff. Owen, you see your hand up?
Hello. Thanks for letting me speak, and apologies for bringing down the tone of this meeting, which is quite highfalutin and academic. I just wanted to respond to two comments that Bruce made. He started by saying that this essay was published in 1961, and I'd know where. And then he gave us the information, which was the Saturday Evening Post. Now that rang a bell with me because I've been working on a timeline for Grandfather that we'd like to update the website with, and I knew he'd had something published in the Saturday Evening Post, but I couldn't remember what it was or what year. So that's why I love participating in these things, because little teasers come out at me, and I get information in this way. And the reason I wanted to put it in the timeline is because I think the Saturday Evening Post is quite a popular sort of journal. It's not highfalutin. So it really shows that Grandfather was reaching out and getting quite a popular audience in this sort of 1960s period. And it went with the photo feature. And the photo that was in that magazine at the time was this photo. I've used it on the back of two of the novellas. So if you've got Eager Spring or Night Operation, that photo is taken from the photo feature next to this essay. And I wanted to get more of this because it's taken by a professional photographer. I contacted the Saturday Evening Post years ago. They gave me the name of a photographer, but that photographer didn't know anything about this, so they gave me the wrong name. Somewhere out there's a kind of a whole series of photos which really look quite good, quite posed, quite professional. It'd be lovely to get more of this series of photos. So, I mean, if I don't know how that would happen, but if there's any contacts with Saturday Evening Post, that's one small thing. How these things just come together, that would be a lovely thing to have more of those pictures. And the other thing is the name Arthur Zajonc was mentioned, and he was a great sort of supporter of Grandfather to the extent that he'd developed a master's degree on Barfieldian studies, and it ran for 2 years. But unfortunately, because of the financial crash, the college that was supporting it folded. So the course was successful, but the college itself didn't survive the financial crash. So there is out there a kind of a master's program with which Arthur Zajonc put together, and it exists. And I don't know what's happened to the sort of that material or the thinking behind it, but it would be lovely to resuscitate that course, and maybe it could be given somewhere else. But the hard work of putting it together and having it certified as an educational course has been done by Arthur. So those are two comments I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Owen. I've never met Arthur Zajonc, but Ashton and I's our mentor and colleague Robert McDermott is good friends with Arthur, and I will ask through Robert if any of that curriculum is still available. It'd be wonderful to have that. Thanks for mentioning it.
The college was one in Massachusetts. It's an anthro college. I think it's something like Spring Valley, something like that. But people would know. But it's a college that folded around about 2007. Maybe it's reinvented itself. But so the
Yeah,
course kind of started it in 2005 and 2006, and then folded in 2007, I think.
so I was working.
Sunbridge,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I was working at Sunbridge College at that time, so I know quite a lot about it. It's in Spring Valley, New York, which is in Rockland County. And Sunbridge still exists. Now it's the Sunbridge Institute. And so it's a Waldorf teacher training part-time. But it's part of the threefold community, which is an incredible community that has Green Meadow Waldorf School, that has the fellowship community for elder people where they're growing a lot of their own food. So it's kind of the grandfather anthroposophical community in the US. It's really worth visiting if anybody gets a chance. But the Barfield School existed for 2 seasons, as you say, Owen. And it was not through finances, but Sunbridge lost their accreditation to issue master's degrees. That's what actually happened, which was really unfortunate. And with that, the Owen Barfield, which was this incredible constellation of faculty, not very many students, so it was really a circle. The way it was being held was really beautiful. Yeah.
Lauren. Go ahead.
Hi. All right. So off of I wanted to build off of what was said earlier. And this is an exercise for me to try and articulate something that's I've been, I guess, pondering for a while. So thank you for dealing with my slow articulation. So this phrase that you mentioned, the human imagination at its highest level does indeed inherit and continue the divine creative activity. So I'm writing a paper on the meaning crisis, which is one of the reasons I joined this, to help me gain some material and articulation for that paper. And the thesis of the paper is how educators can be beacons of meaning in the meaning crisis. So beacons of purpose, sorry. Educators can be beacons of purpose in the meaning crisis. So this phrase about the human imagination at its highest level, inheriting and continuing the divine creative activity. And some of the things that he points to earlier in this essay, it focuses in me an experience that I have that I think is important for bringing this about in a larger social body. I feel that the internal capacity that we have for perceiving parts and wholes is the same capacity or very similar internal muscle that we need for perceiving levels of complexity. And I say that because I think one eclipses the other. So as we, with the scientific method and with the mechanistic paradigm, we have, as a social body and as individuals, we have learned to perceive parts and wholes, and how that has brought about the meaning crisis. So I feel that as we exercise our ability to see levels of complexity and therefore the relational meaning between all of the levels of complexity, that well, that's a remedy to the meaning crisis. But the real question then is how to bring that about. What exercises, what practices help us to build that organ of perception of levels of complexity? So as Matt mentioned, there's practices in science and biology and on this micro level. And then Barfield also mentions in this essay, like these levels of complexity about sociology, psychology, right? These are levels of complexity. And so rather than perceiving them as parts of the human experience or the natural experience or a biological experience, but perceiving them relationally, right? That the collective experience of a microbiology results in the next level of complexity. And the maybe to speak of it like in Confucian terms, right? The collective experience of my family, right, then results in the experience of us as a whole, and then how we relate to the next level of complexity of our immediate neighborhood, right? So the Confucian teaching was always to find peace within yourself, create peace within your family, then peace within your greater surroundings, right? That's another example of levels of complexity. So I've been working with the Presencing Institute and Theory U for many years, and Lisa here is on the call as well. We've been a part of the Theory U community for many years. And one of the most important aspects of Theory U is shifting the interior condition, right? So the theory is taking a deep dive below the surface, coming to a moment of presencing where there's a shift in interior condition, then rising up again into the activity of life, the outer participatory activity with that shifted interior condition to create different levels of change. So, and Theory U is also based on Goethean science and draws much from anthroposophy as well. So I think that there's an important crossover here that I haven't been able to articulate yet, but I'm aiming towards articulating that, of the importance of shifting our interior condition to be able to perceive levels of complexity, and particularly because I'm in education, passing on that capacity to the next generation, supporting them in perceiving levels of complexity rather than parts and wholes. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, lots of resonance between your work and what we're exploring here. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. April, hi there.
Hi, thank you all so much for this. I'm newer to this, to Owen Barfield and to this idea of Goethean traditions and ways of Goethean science. So I appreciate that this may be an elementary question, but I'd love to hear how um, the the evolution of this science has included ways of thinking and being that are outside the Western traditions, and um, ways of thinking and being that have maybe preserved a little bit of this meaning in them, whether that's indigenous ways of thinking or whether that's other Eastern traditions that have maybe been a little better than us in the West at preserving some of the holistic piece of this, and where that might be fitting in the conversation.
That's a great question. I've heard people characterize Goethe's approach and Steiner after him as something like kind of quasi-shamanic, where there and before I discovered Goethe, I read a bunch about like ethnobotany and just works by ethnobotanists, and just the notion of doctrine of signatures, just all these even in pre-modern European ways of thinking about nature are very resonant. So there's definitely an obvious connection, but as far as I know, I don't know a whole lot about people working in this particular stream bridging, but I'm sure there has been. Maybe somebody else here has some thoughts to share about that.
I would just quickly say that, well, one thing only. There's many things that could be said, I think, but that my anthroposophical doctor, God rest his soul, definitely worked with all forms of holistic and holistic healing from all traditions, pretty much all traditions. I mean, one can't canvas everything, but it was part of the way he thought anthroposophically extended medicine needed to be extended, out of metamorphosing both out of the Western tradition and the confluence of disciplines and traditions. Um, yes, I would say, and it's also, I think, important not to narrowly think about science as something branded in our times, that it's an ontological framework that has to do with knowledge on all levels. So you could say there are the interior sciences that are metamorphosing out into phenomenology and psychology, for example. And these would be examples that are already happening. And I would think that people who, like Robert Sardello, might be thinking of himself as someone who is doing that from a phenomenologically psychological point of view.
Kat?
Hey, um, uh, Matt, thank you so much for bringing out the potentia. That really stood out for me in the essay as well. And because every time I see that word, my background is mathematics, so I think of potential energy. It goes to physics, sort of a knee-jerk reaction. And so Barfield's focus on that, I've read it in several essays, and I never really have been able to wrap my head around what he's talking about. But in this essay, it seems like that he's linking that the potential is what's in the inside. It's what he calls, I think in other places, latent potentia. And that makes everything, it kind of brings everything together for me. So thank you for pointing that out. There was one other thing I was thinking about as I was reading this, and it is that meaning and truth and knowledge are sort of bound together. And until recently, they have been, well, in the last few hundred years, have been looked at scientifically in a material or a sort of methodical, logical progression of outside observations. And I found in this little book by Lionel Adley, I think is the way you pronounce it, on the Great War, just sort of stumbled over it, a quote that he was using from Owen Barfield on truth. And it resonated with me and connected to this essay. So I thought I would read this on a couple of different pages. Barfield says, truth is not as a fact or known object, but as a process of knowing. I really loved that definition, and it seemed like it maybe goes with Matt's work. So he goes on to say, reality taking the form of consciousness, whether by intuition or judgment of reason. And then later he compares realization and formulation of truth as a dynamic process in which reality becomes in the mind, not a static observation, but again, it's a moving, almost alive process.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing those quotes, Kat. Makes me think of this word participation. Bruce, I see your hand up.
Try to address a little bit of April's question, but it also connects with what Kat just said. And that is a point to the work of botanist Rolf Sattler. Now, Rolf, like other people who Matt and I have both suggested, or maybe are out there, doesn't talk about Goethe at all, has no connection with anthroposophy, has no connection that I know of with Barfield, but it does have he did do things that are very relevant, and they're very relevant to Eastern traditions, which he does have connections with. So I'll try to keep this very brief. So Goethe talked about the lateral organs of a plant all being modified leaves. So in the intellectual traditional tradition in botany, that people have followed up on that by thinking about categories of organs of plants. Leaf, stem, root, flower are the basic categories. Rolf was completely against that. And so he did not like Goethe because it led into that categorization. So Rolf's idea was of complementarity and different and multiple points of view on everything. So he always tried to look at things from multiple points of view. And he and his collaborator, Rolf Rudeshauser, wrote a number of papers, quite a number of papers, from very different aspects, showing that plants could be looked at from these complementary points of view and shouldn't be considered just as consisting of these archetypal organs. He was really, as I say, really against that. So I'll place, he's got a website now, and you'll have to look through it because he's also interested in philosophy, and he wrote a lot about Wilbur's ideas of philosophy. So his website is called Beyond Wilbur. But his botanical work is also in there, and he's got some videos up on YouTube that you can look at too if you're interested in Rolf's work. He was out. I haven't explained how it's connected. You maybe see a little bit of how it's connected to Eastern traditions, but Rolf, it was known in Eastern traditions that he had this connection because he was invited to speak at the Dalai Lama's 60th birthday celebration. So there were, he had that kind of, he's still alive. And if you were interested in talking to him, he would answer your emails and be happy to talk about these ideas.
Thanks, Bruce. Hey, Ryan, I don't know if you feel like doing this right now, but just wanted to invite you to share about the online program that you mentioned to us. There he is.
Hello. I was staying quiet. Hi, I'm Ryan Shea. I'm a full-time researcher and educator at the Nature Institute, which was founded by Craig and Henrika Holdridge and their friend Steve Talbot, dedicated to the pursuit of Goethean phenomenology of nature, Goethean science full-time. And yeah, so we have a big foundation course, 15 months, half in person, half online. The applications for that are open, but we also have a new small online course that's an introduction to Goetheanism. A series is running in the fall, and a new series going through Craig's book, Thinking Like a Plant, will be starting in the spring. So I'll put a link to the side thing. But yeah, so the Nature Institute is one of the people. We're right down the road from Jordan. I live like 5 minutes away from him. Yeah, so, and as Matt just posted in the side thing, Craig gave a talk at the Cognizing Life conference. So we're connected into this small network of people there at the Goetheanum at Ruskin Mill in England, which also I'll put a link to that. Ruskin Mill just started, the first cohort will run next year, a 3-year master's in transformative learning, which you'll see just from the initial description of it. It will now be one of the more systematic trainings in this kind of Goethean transformational, metamorphic, phenomenological work in the world. And there is actually one more educational initiative that's in groundswell process right now in Australia through the efforts of Nigel Hoffman and some other interesting Australian Goetheans, where they're trying to start a 4-year phenomenological training initiative. So there is an interesting increase in these sorts of things, and a lot of these smaller micro-college programs like Thoreau College in Wisconsin are picking up and trying to implement a lot of these in an educational model. So you're getting an increase in some amount of attempt to enable this as an educational paradigm sort of popping up around. So exciting times. I wasn't going to say anything, but I got gang pressed by Ashton, so
Yeah.
that's my pick.
Thanks, Ryan. That's exciting. Yeah, if you haven't heard of the Nature Institute, it's the real deal what they're doing there. So if you're curious about Gertian science, I would check that out. All right. Well, thanks everybody. It's a great conversation as always. See you again in 2 weeks. We're reading, what's the next one? Dream Myth and Philosophical Double Vision. It's a very great essay. All right, everybody. Have a great day, great night, wherever you are.